Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today I'm visiting a very important spot for Texas history. It's an area in Nacogdoches, Texas known as the Old Stone Fort. And this Old Stone Fort was so important because it was an important stop on the El Camino Real, which crossed across all of Texas back in the 1700s and 1800s. This spot was also really well known for some significant Texas events. Now, the stone fort that's behind me has been rebuilt and moved here. It actually used to exist in downtown Nacogdoches, and right now I'm on the campus of SFA, or Stephen F. Austin University. But this is a recreation of that stone fort, so we can talk about some of the history and some of its importance while I'm here. So let's go learn a little bit more about the stone fort in Nacogdoches, Texas, the idea of El Camino Real, as well as some of the significant characters and historic events that took place around this location. So what was the El Camino Real? Well, here's a nice map showing the El Camino Real here in this, I guess, tannish color. And you can see it actually starts in Nacogdoches, which is actually in Louisiana, comes all the way through St. Augustine to Nacogdoches, where I'm at today. And this was really kind of the entry point into Texas. And everybody who came through this area would have to come to the stone fort and check in, or would come to the stone fort and check in, because this was a popular spot for trading goods, for finding about what road conditions were, and for finding places to stay within Nacogdoches. The trail would continue from Nacogdoches and continue through a town called CROCKETT, and you'll see there are various ways they could go. Eventually, most people ended up in San Antonio, and then from there can actually end up in Guerrero in Mexico. But you will see there are these other branches. There's these series of trails that would connect all these Texas communities together back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Here's a little bit more about the stone house, or what's known as a stone fort. And it really wasn't truly a fort. It was more like a house, a warehouse. And you'll see some of the old pictures from 1788 to 1902, what it looked like. And this is when it resided down in the downtown Nacogdoches area, kind of how it fell apart in 1902. And eventually they ended up, of course, rebuilding it here on the Stephen F. Austin site. You can see what it looked like in 1935, and again kind of in 1936, where people were hanging out on it. So it's been a center of a lot of activity in Nacogdoches, as well as a center of history for Texas. So what kind of famous people stayed here? Well, from Texas history, people like Davy CROCKETT would have passed through this place. JIM BOWIE would have passed through this place as well. This was also the site of what helped kick off the revolution in Texas in 1835. The big thing that happened was started really down in Anahuac, and from what happened in Anahuac, the Mexican government was very concerned about what settlers were going to do in this area. So the Mexican military asked for all the settlers' guns here, and of course the folks here revolted and eventually ended up kicking out the Mexican military from the eastern part of Texas in what was known as the Battle of Nacogdoches. So here I am in downtown Nacogdoches, and this was the center of a very important battle in Texas independence history. Now, it doesn't look like much today. You can see old cobblestone streets, but this was the spot of a very intense battle between the Texians and the Mexican military. I previously showed you all the stone fort. So the stone fort actually used to exist right about where this Commercial Bank of Texas is at. Somewhere in this general vicinity is where that stone fort was. In this vicinity took place one of the early battles that helped set up what would eventually become the Texas Revolution. On August 2nd, 1832, there was a battle here known as the Battle of Nacogdoches, where General Pedras with a Mexican garrison here asked the settlers to give up their arms. And of course the Texians raised a force, said no, you're not going to get our arms. Some of the Texians behind that were famous people like JIM BOWIE. And they came here and they actually ended up fighting in this general location, going street to street, building to building, house to house. At the end of the day, there were about 400 Mexican soldiers and there were about 350 Texian soldiers. And at the end, there were about 40 of the Mexican soldiers that had perished and about as many wounded. And there were about 3 that died from the Texian side and 3 or 4 that were wounded. Eventually, a peace treaty was signed in this area, which helped establish for a short period of time some peace. But of course, as we all know, eventually there would end up being the final war for Texas independence. So without the intervention or representation of the Mexican government, this part of Texas, this easternmost portion of Texas, really became a bit of an independent place where they were able to have a little bit more self-governed rule. Although they were still under the banner of Mexico, they didn't have local officials from that area. So it was a very different type of ruling, different type of culture. Now that led to some other interesting incidents later on in the history of Nacogdoches. Here's more information about the old stone fort. You'll see here that this is an 18th century structure, so it was built in the late 1700s really. And it was actually built by a gentleman, Antonio Gil y Barbo, and they say he built it between 1788 and 1791. So this was a center of activity for Nacogdoches and travelers coming from the United States via Louisiana into the area that will eventually become Texas. So let's go take a look at the museum. So the museum hours are 10 to 5, and I'll put a link down below so you can find out more about it. If you happen to be in the Nacogdoches area, you can come here and check out the museum as well. So let's go check this out. Let's see if we can learn a little bit more about the old stone fort here in Nacogdoches, Texas. All right, let's go head into the museum. Let's see what we can learn about the old stone fort. So as you enter inside, you'll see these aren't very big rooms. Here I am for scale. And here are some examples from some of the early settlers to this area, the indigenous people. And there's everything from arrows to what we call points to grindstones. And you'll see these range from 2000 BC to 800 AD, so quite a long period of time. So here's a look at downtown Nacogdoches early on, kind of what it looked like, and this is in the 1800s, so not the earliest, but you'll see where the different layout would be, and this is what the old stone fort would have looked like at that time. So as I go into each of these rooms, you can see the general size of them, and you'll see a fireplace. Now, one thing I just learned from one of the docents here is that there are a whole bunch of doors at the front of the building, and because they didn't build doorways like we see here between rooms, Spanish architecture didn't do that, you'd actually go out one door and go outside to go back inside to the next room, because you actually weren't able to walk from room to room based on how the Spanish originally built this building. Pretty interesting fact. So here's working up some stairs from 1936 going to the upstairs portion of the old stone fort. They are very narrow and they are very steep, so if you are visiting here sometime, be aware of that. And they actually have another set of stairs you can walk up. What's neat is now that we're in the upstairs portion, we're going to get a slightly different view of this old stone fort building. And in the upstairs portion, they have a lot of memorabilia about early life in Texas. Here's an old travel case trunk. Here's another old travel case trunk. Here's some old chairs. The other thing that strikes me as I walk through here, even knowing that this is a replica, is the idea that, you know, something like this is where so many kind of classic iconic figures from Texas would have stayed in the earlier version of this. Is really fascinating to me. Now they do have stuff from World War, it looks like World War I and World War II from Texans that served as well up here. So a whole bunch of just various Texas history and various Texas historic items. And here's looking in the next room, so you can see glass bottles. There's an old outfit, an old chair. The ambiance is pretty neat in here. It's a bit, I will say, a little bit spooky too in some ways. Here's some, I guess, early handguns owned by various people from Texas history. Let's see what they say about some of these. Some of these are revolvers and swords from the Civil War, and then you can see this old musket here from Springfield, 1835 musket. So this would have been probably the type of musket that was used during the Texas Civil War or the Texas Battle for Independence. And here are the stairs going down the other direction. So these are the more modern stairs. So if you do come visit, this is a little bit easier to walk up and down than the stairs from 1936. So from the outside, you can really see all these different doors. The reason there's so many doors on the outside of the old stone fort is, as an original Spanish building, the Spanish didn't put doors between the different rooms inside of the building. So to go from one room to the next, you actually had to go outside and back in. You will see there's a wraparound porch up above as well that allowed the guests and tenants and business owners to do the same thing. Thank you all for joining me today to learn about Texas history, to check out this old stone fort here in Nacogdoches, Texas. Nacogdoches, Texas being the oldest settlement by Europeans here in Texas. So thanks again for joining me. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel, Earth and Time. Join me for a lot more adventures around Texas and beyond. And of course, take care.